Welcome back to another episode of the Meat Mafia podcast. If this is your first time joining us, we have one goal and one goal only, and that is that you, yes, you, listen to this podcast and get at least one valuable piece of information that inspires you to go radically change your health today. If this is your second, third, fourth, or 100th time listening to the Meat Mafia podcast, we are so grateful to have you, and we are so thankful for your continued support. Before we get going, if you would not mind going and following us on all of our platforms, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and of course, Twitter, we would greatly appreciate it. This just allows us to expand our reach, and your reviews, comments, and feedback give us more and more things to think about and improve the show with. Lastly, this is a user-supported podcast and newsletter, and we would not be able to do what we love doing without your generous support and the support from our sponsors. We take great pride in the relationships that we've built with our sponsors and truly believe that they are the best resources out there for better health. Your support and their support, and you supporting them, means the world to us. If you are enjoying the podcast and getting value out of it, please check us out on the Fountain app below, where you can support us by streaming us sats or sending us support via our Fountain Bitcoin wallet. Without further ado, here is a word from our sponsors. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by The Carnivore Bar. The Carnivore Bar is a veteran-owned, animal-based company focused on bringing you the highest quality pemmican product on the market. Pemmican is an ancient tradition practiced by American indigenous cultures, and it's focused on simple ingredients: beef, tallow, and salt. It's built for grab-and-go snacking, and it's a great sort of travel, hiking, or school lunch snack. And it's really built for those long-lasting days where you can just run on basically no fuel other than just simple fats. It's rich in saturated fats and provides everything you need to sustain long-lasting energy throughout the busy day. In my opinion, this is a product that is an absolute must, so go check it out in the link below. Also, check out our podcast with the founder, Philip Meese. He does an incredible job breaking down the mission and the passion behind the company. And I think if you're interested in animal-based nutrition, Philip will inspire you with his product. This episode of the podcast is also brought to you by Holy Cow Beef. Holy Cow Beef is regeneratively raised, grass-fed, grass-finished beef raised right here in Lubbock, Texas. Regeneratively raised, grass-fed, grass-finished beef is the gold standard of beef, and Ann and Weldon Warren have made it their lives' mission to provide incredibly high-quality beef to their local community and beyond. They have been raising their animals this way for decades. In fact, they were some of the most influential voices for getting grass-fed and grass-finished beef in Whole Foods back when Whole Foods was a startup grocery store. They were influential in setting the AGA standards, which is the American Grass-Fed Association, so you know they are doing things the right way, and on top of all of that, their beef tastes like butter. Grass-fed, grass-finished beef provides a superior omega-3 to omega-6 ratio than your typical beef, or in other words, it causes less inflammation in your body. So you are promoting a high protein, high fat diet with this amazingly high quality beef, and saturated fats are playing their critical role in benefiting your body through supporting hormonal functions and cellular functions. And if you're looking for the highest quality beef, look no further than Holy Cow Beef. Leave your butcher box, that Australian and New Zealand raised meat, in the cart and order from your friends Ann and Weldon Warren over at Holy Cow Beef. I almost forgot the most important part there. Ann and Weldon Warren also accept Bitcoin as payment, so go check them out at their website in the link below, and you can pay in Bitcoin or in cash if you're looking to save your Bitcoin. I don't know about you all, but I am all about rewriting the incentives when it comes to healthcare, and CrowdHealth is doing just that. CrowdHealth is essentially crowdfunding for healthcare with a small HSA component mixed in. Paying through the nose for health insurance you may never use, only to be turned away when you actually need it, is incredibly frustrating. Also, the exorbitant costs of health insurance has so many baked in premiums that when you compare settling your doctor's bills by paying in cash versus using insurance, the cost is astronomical. So crowdfunding allows you to settle your medical bills in cash and then get the funding you need from your group through CrowdHealth. This is a great alternative to health insurance for people who are low risk, healthy people who just want peace of mind knowing that if anything actually did happen, they do have a pool of funds to pull from to cover their medical costs. The best part, my group is saving a portion of the monthly opt-in in Bitcoin, and the rest is in cash. So those savings are going towards actually preserving long-term value for my group through a vehicle like Bitcoin. We are really excited about this concept, and since the business model is predicated on an incentive-based healthcare, it is a great concept. For people with low risk, minimal healthcare costs, it is a no-brainer. Go check them out in the link below and use our promo code MAFIA for a discount on your first 6 months with Crowd Health. Jeff, what's going on, man? Welcome to the Meat Mafia podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we're excited to dig in with you. Everything related to the stuff that you and your wife are doing with Colorado Craft Beef. And we were saying before we hit record that you have an awesome nutritional story. You know, over the last couple of years, you're a rancher turned carnivore and have had some pretty unbelievable results. So I think we'd love to start this off, just learning a little bit more about your nutritional journey and how that's been going for you the last few years.
Sure. I mean, without the understanding where it started, it's kind of hard to say where I got to. Mm-hmm. I grew up in a small town in Oregon, and my mom loved to cook. She owned multiple restaurants. So if you had a bad day, let's eat some food. If you had a good day, let's eat some food. Oh, it's cold outside. Let's eat some food. So nothing on them. I mean, that was my own doing, but that manifested throughout college with, drinking and partying and corporate sales. And next thing you know, I was 37 and my first daughter was born. I was holding her in the hospital. And as you guys learned through the podcast, I'm kind of a math nerd. And I was 37 and I'm holding her and I look at myself. And I'm like, man, when she's 18, graduating high school, I'm going to be 55. And at that point, I was 315 pounds. And I was like, and I'm 6'3", I'm not a small guy. And I had some people tell me, like, you weren't obese, but you were big. And then I've looked back at pictures. I'm like, man, that's so nice of you guys to say that because you're just wrong. And it was about 6 weeks after that, we were at a KetoCon event in Omaha for the beef company. Dr. Baker was there. That was actually where I met him for the first time. And it was co-hosted with Redmond Real Salt. And Dr. Jamie Seaman was hosting the VIP night. And Dr. Baker and I hung out, and he looks at me and he's like, so, have you tried carnivore? And I had all the standard excuses. Oh, I'm too busy. I'm too this. I'm too whatever. And he looks at me and, very polite said, you own a beef company. What excuse could you really have? You're not wrong. And the next morning we were headed back from Omaha to the ranch and Instagram blew up. And it was because Dr. Baker announced on Instagram I was going 90 days carnivore. And my wife asked me, she goes, what are you going to do? I think it's political suicide to not do that, right? Mm-hmm. Like, post a picture of us together. Like, I got to drink the Kool-Aid. And in that first 9 days, I dropped like 45 pounds. And from there, I just kind of kept working on it. Actually got a health coach this year. Did more of a PKD type focus, paleo ketogenic with a really high fat content. Found out in the meantime that my family has a history of type 2 diabetes. So started tracking insulin, started doing a lot of those biological markers to understand. And, this year really hit it hard. And I was at Dr. Baker's place in September. And at that point, I was down 90 pounds from when we met 3 years before that. Wearing pants in a size I haven't bought since high school, and went to my hometown on that same trip back in Oregon and said hi to people that literally babysat me when I was a kid, that 2 or 3 days later when they saw me, like, I'm really sorry, I didn't recognize you. So it's not without its set of failures, right? Like, it took me 3 years to lose 90 pounds. I probably could have done it in a year if I wanted to. But at the same time, you've got to have quality of life. I went to Pebble Beach for my sister-in-law's wedding this year, and I'm here to tell you, we were not carnivore and we were not abstaining from alcohol on that trip. Like, You got to live life too. But my mission at this point is to be a good role model for my girls and, do things without excess and do things with intent and to, be a better person tomorrow than I was today. And that's not all weight. Maybe you got to have a cupcake because you were having a bad day or whatever. But like I mentioned before the podcast, I don't want to trade an unhealthy relationship and being overweight and having a bad relationship with food for having a, oppositely driven bad relationship with food to not eat the food to be thin. So I think you've got to find that healthy balance. And that probably was the hardest thing for me personally.
Yeah, that message definitely resonates with us. I'm curious, when or how quickly did the light bulb go off for you that like, oh, this carnivore diet actually works and I'm going to be able to make some serious progress here if I stick with this?
2 weeks.
Dang.
Yeah, within 2 weeks, I was like, holy cow, like what have I been doing?
Literally.
Yeah. And then when I got more serious about it this year with my health coach, who helped me a ton, being educated about what I was eating, using the markers on ketosis and insulin and blood sugar, probably helped the most because I think one of the biggest misconceptions in carnivore is that you can eat as much as you want. With what I've learned and that worked for me, I'm not saying it works for other people, is I had to eat more fat content to not get hungry. And that extra fat content helped me stay in ketosis better. I saw your Element water bottle just a minute ago, Brett. We use a lot of Element here at the ranch. We're buddies with Rob. And, if you've got a craving, you've got to know what to do with that. So the chocolate salt helps me a lot if I get a craving.
Definitely.
So it's finding those things that help you in a positive way, but not being owned by your diet.
Equip's Unflavored Prime has one single ingredient derived directly from grass-fed beef protein. For purists like ourselves who try to only consume balanced, real sources of nutrition, this protein powder checks all the boxes. Go check them out in the link below and use our promo code in the description to get a discount.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. Using some of these things as tools. Harry and I were talking before we hit the record button, whether it's like, throwing Element in your water, that way you're getting some great sodium content, but then maybe you just want a little bit of flavor. Maybe you miss out on soda or something like that, or having a Zevia every once in a while, which is carbonated soda with a stevia leaf, or even some like Equip protein powder. Like, is everything as good as just eating steak, water, and salt? No, absolutely not. But knowing how to kind of strategically work these things in a way that makes it sustainable, I think that's such a good point. I don't think enough people talk about that. So I totally agree with what you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, do you want to float on a parachute and understand you're going to lose a little altitude sometimes, or do you want to fall off the wagon in catastrophic failure?
Yeah.
And if you find those things to help keep you propped up, it's going to be better for you long-term, not just physically, but mentally as well. Because when you have those falls off the wagon, a week later, you're fat and bloated and you feel like a failure. And then you're harder on yourself and maybe you're grumpy with your family. Like all this stuff, business, health, money, whatever, it all has to be done in a way that we maximize our potential in life and optimize our relationships.
Right.
Yeah.
Were you eating mostly your own beef when you went carnivore? Until
COVID hit, yes. During COVID, we were back ordered for about 8 months with the beef company. So luckily we were able to get caught up on that pretty quickly. But during that time, actually, I ordered from a bunch of our competitors just to try their stuff. So I ordered from Snake River, and I ordered from Crowd Cow, and I ordered from a lot of the other direct-to-consumer people. And, because it's a business expense, because we're doing marketing research, that was helpful.
Yeah.
But also, it gave us a good chance to understand other packaging, other insulation, other insulators, other value chains people are using for shipping, and just some of that early focus, strategic marketing play helped a bunch.
Wow. Jeff, what was the difference for you? So you mentioned you did carnivore. Dr. Baker kind of throws you into this 90-day challenge. You're going into it. You're following a strict carnivore diet. And now you mentioned it seems like you have like a little bit more of a sustainable approach working with a health coach. How has that been, kind of just doing it on your own versus now following this approach that with the health coach, it probably is more measured and scientific, and maybe sustainable is the right word to use. But yeah, would love to learn more about that.
You're 100% spot on. But probably the biggest thing is the health coach I had and have, he's still a good buddy of mine. He donated his time to me. And I have a personal respect for people to do that. Mm-hmm. And it was a big part of me and holding myself accountable to show him the respect for his time to try to do as well as I could. And, had I been paying him, would I have treated it the same? Like, hey man, I paid my bill, like get off my back. I don't know. But he's a very hardcore guy. So he doesn't tolerate BS very well. That kind of helped me a lot. I grew up in a military family. So, take the psychology of all that other stuff and then put it with a bad relationship with food and, 2 kids under 3 and a wife and multiple businesses. I mean, there's a perfect mix that needs to happen so that it is sustainable. Mm. And that's probably the hardest part of any of your listeners. It's, if you were put on an island with unlimited decisions about food and nothing else, you could probably do okay. But now throw losing a job or restructuring or your car breaks down or whatever in the middle of that, you can't sustain all of it forever. Yeah. And that's probably the hardest part, is being in a position that you can maintain as good as possible.
Maybe before we dive into what you're doing on the ranch and the business side of stuff, I'm really curious. Brett and I are 2 single guys who don't have kids. So like, it's really easy to optimize for lifestyle stuff when it comes to eating correctly. We have a little bit more time. We're working remotely. So we really are kind of like the perfect scenario when it comes to being able to dial in the lifestyle stuff and nutrition stuff. So what we try to do is create sort of a spectrum for people to think about their health so that, hey, if you're trying to look like Arnold, like this is the path you take. If you're trying to hit something that is sustainable and you're going to be able to balance, like this, this is the right path to take. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, having kids and having a lifestyle, like what sort of things did you rely on, or what principles sort of helped you really balance everything out?
That was learning by bumping into the walls. I mean, that was like driving with Braille. There was no other way to learn it. Because one of the things you want to do when you're especially losing a lot of weight and doing PKD is 1 or 2 meals a day, and don't eat after 2 p.m. So now you're not sitting down with your wife and your kids to have dinner. So I would make dinner for them because I cooked most of the food in the house. And then I would sit with them at the table. That was probably one of the hardest things. So it was really just finding that groove. And what I found mostly for myself is if I got out of the groove, it was so much harder to get back in. Mm-hmm. Most of the time, like I'll eat a meal a day, a steak or something, maybe have some snacks in the evening. That's kind of how I've done it so that I can sit with the girls at night. But I'm mindful of how I do it. And if I really fall off the wagon, and the first 3 days getting back on the wagon with cravings and your body metabolism catching up and everything else is really tough. So I would recommend, figure out what works for you, but also listen to the science, listen to your body, because you're going to feel it. And if you're not feeling it, you're doing something wrong, because you should feel better or you should feel worse. Mm-hmm. Find things to track like blood sugar. Find something that's traceable. In the business community, I do business consulting and other things like that as well. You can't manage what you can't measure. So, I think I feel better today. Okay, cool. Well, let's prove it. Mm-hmm. And you can get a blood glucose monitor at Walmart for $20 or $30. So find some of those things to help hold yourself accountable, but then also realize that we're all human and life happens. And what's your trend? Are we better than we were a month ago?
Yeah. And when we talk about being human and life happening to us, I know one of the things that you had mentioned was just, this topic of stress and how you have a couple young kids and you're an entrepreneur and you have businesses. And I imagine that's something that a lot of people go through, is just trying to optimize their mindset and balancing all these things without getting out of whack and stress. And I know we're obviously just meeting each other, but you seem like you have a really solid mindset. And I'm just curious, like, if you'd be willing to share just maybe some of the mental models or things that you go back to that really help you perform at a high level and manage the stress that maybe a lot of people don't do the best job dealing with.
Sure. I would say one of the things a lot of my consulting and coaching clients struggle with the most is failure. They think of failure as a 4-letter word. And one of my coaches early on in my career told me, he said, the more successful you want to be, you have to be just as good with failure to get there. Mm-hmm. Because you hit a home run and you go on a really high level podcast, or you knock down a business deal, or you do whatever. Well, you probably struck out 100 times to make that work. So the trick is to not stop. And the trick is to not beat yourself up over failures. It's being okay with failure. It's eating the cupcake and not feeling guilty about it, to, tie it up with the nutritional model. And it's being able to be resilient. Luckily for me, the first 5 to 10 years of my career, I was in heavy construction. We were doing roads and building schools and all sorts of heavy stuff. And especially in the government construction world, you go to work with boxing gloves on every day because everybody's fighting over money. I got to I've been on job sites when we tipped excavators over, when we've hit water lines. After a decade of that, you're pretty immune to nonsense. And, rather than wallowing in the problems that are always going to show up, they never go away. I mean, no matter where you get, Elon has problems just the same as we do. They're probably different, but, somebody's like, oh, well, he doesn't have money problems. Well, when he has money problems, there's a lot more commas behind it. It's going to probably change your outlook a little bit. So everything's relative, but it's how you handle it. And the problems aren't going to go away. And I think probably the biggest misnomer that I run into is everybody thinks, oh, once I get to this spot, everything's smooth sailing. Well, you can lie to yourself, but the problems don't stop. And it's, take the wins. Take the wins when you earn them. And if you don't feel like you've earned enough, keep working, but don't beat yourself up, because that's your brain. I mean, that's just cancer of a mindset that's going to keep you from doing the things you're probably meant to do.
Yeah. How important is momentum in all of this? When, you're talking about someone who's an entrepreneur, you have multiple businesses. And I think one of the things that Brett and I realized pretty quickly in our entrepreneurial journey is that momentum and just stacking the small wins, even if they are small, that's the sort of thing that compounds over time, not even in like a financial sense, but it's really just in that, like, hey, we can keep this thing going. And like, we still have the energy to really drive all of our time and focus into this. So are you someone who kind of, like, I think like fear and like momentum almost are like cousins, or if you're focusing on the momentum, it kind of like drowns out the fear and like lets you kind of just amplify all the good things that you're doing. Not to say that you need to ignore those, the fears or the negative things that are being, or challenges that are being presented to you. But, I do think that having that positive outlook is just so valuable when it comes to really diving into the entrepreneurial world.
100%. And everybody will espouse positive mindset. Brad Lee, Gary Vee, all those guys are talking positive mindset. They're not wrong, right? Yeah. You don't get out of bed every morning going, man, I wish somebody punched me in the face this morning. I'll take that back. Some of the guys at my gym just get up because they love going to the gym to get beat up. But in general, if you don't provide your own momentum, nobody's going to do it for you. And so you have to figure out where to find that momentum. Because, I mean, the Rounders, the movie, Matt Damon, there's a quote in there that said, very few poker players remember the really big wins of their career, but they can remember with unmistakable accuracy their bad beats. You can't do that in business, because you're going to end up having fear from indecision. And then you're going to have indecision, which leads to inaction, which leads to someone passing you or the opportunity disappearing. So positive mindset helps, but you've also, I've had a few people on podcasts or in my coaching business ask, define in one word what's most important in business. And my standard answer is honesty. And, I work in agriculture and everybody's like, yeah, great. You got to be honest with other people. And I'm like, well, the honesty I am referring to is honesty with yourself. Look in the mirror. If you think that you're being honest with yourself and you're not, you're going to have way more problems than if your neighbor lies to you.
Right.
And, agriculture as a career, I've been in a lot of different sectors within agriculture from the time my degree is in agriculture. My first job in agriculture, I was 12. So, and there is a ton of emphasis put in agriculture on being able to shake a man's hand and know that what you said is how it's going to go. There's not a lot of contracts in ag, especially in the older generations. I had some time in private equity, so I'm a little more paperwork heavy than some of my brothers and sisters in ag. But at the end of the day, if you can't be honest with the guy that watches you brush your teeth every morning, how can you truly be honest with everything else?
Yeah. And at the end of the day too, how honest you're being with yourself as well, right?
Yeah.
When you're alone with your thoughts, that's the most honest you'll ever be. And your gut instinct never lies to you. There's a reason why we have such a strong factory installed gut instinct as humans. And, if you're on the right path and chasing down your potential, which I think is a term that you used before. And it's something that Harry spent a lot, and I spent a lot of time thinking about, and when you're just not, and you're just pissing it away.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of people that see that in corporate America, and they're pissing away their potential. They acknowledge it, but they're also not willing to do anything about it. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. I've got some really good friends that work 8 to 5 jobs and they make a solid salary. They support their family. They want no additional risk, and they want to go home at 5 o'clock and turn it all off. And my answer is, if you're happy with that, go be happy. Hell yeah. Everybody needs to be happy in their own way. But what we can't do is put our level of happy against somebody else and make a comparison.
Definitely. Yeah, no, 100%. We agree. And you gave a perfect segue too, Jeff, because I think you'd mentioned how you've been in agriculture since you're 12 years old. And then you mentioned that you have this interesting stint in private equity, which is extremely rare for a rancher. And now you have a D2C beef business with Colorado Craft Beef, which we followed. I followed you guys for some time. So can we talk through that progression, just how everything kind of culminated to what you're doing now?
Yeah. So I grew up working. My dad was a SWAT officer in the Department of Defense. My mom owned a small real estate company. We had a small hobby farm. And from the time I could reach pedals on a tractor, I was helping somebody do something. I was baling hay for people. And, when you're 14 years old and you can't drive and the farmer picks you up at 3 a.m. to go bale hay, and there's grown men that don't do that. And I was happy as heck to do it. It was awesome. And you rogue rye and you work on harvest crews. So I did the first ever many years until college of my career was a lot of grain, a lot of hay, and a lot of cows. Went to college at Colorado State University after graduating from a junior college in my hometown in Pendleton, Oregon. Got a degree in agricultural business with minors in finance and accounting for no reason other than I'm good at math and I love ag. I can probably do an ag business degree and make that work. Soil is not my jam. Chemistry is not my jam. Animal science is as close as I get in the science realm. But my wife has a master's degree in cow nutrition, so I just ask her and follow instructions accordingly. When you guys get married, you will learn why I do it that way.
Yes, honey. Yep.
Yeah, well, right. There's a time and place for that, but it's also about letting people do their thing. Mm-hmm. And that works well in business too, right? After school, I went to work for a company called Cargill. You guys have probably heard of them. Largest privately held company in the world at the time. I ran grain elevators for them. We were loading trains that were shipping. When I was in Nebraska, most of our trains went to New Orleans. And when I was in Minnesota, most of our trains went to Seattle, and all that grain got exported. So, you're talking heavy industrial agriculture. And, we're receiving the facility in Minnesota that I operated. I had a crew of 40 guys. I was 23. We had a chemical inputs location or crop inputs location, which is a chemical warehouse and a fertilizer tower. We had our own application machines, and then we had around 7 million bushels in storage of grain. And to give you an idea, a bushel of grain is about a 5-gallon bucket. And a semi of grain is about 800 bushels. So not a small operation. And I was there for about a year, moved back to Oregon, went to work, doing some capital project stuff, went into construction, ran some pretty big projects, from local football stadiums to building schools and highways and heavy commercial stuff. And when I met my wife, she was living in Idaho. I was living in Oregon, and found a job with a company called the Bratney Company. They're out of Des Moines, Iowa. They sell grain cleaning equipment. They sell robotics, like stacking palletizers and grain cleaning equipment, rail loading facility stuff. So it worked out really well because I'd been a facility manager at facilities that were the target customers of this company. So now I made the transition from operations and general management to technical sales, where I was part of the team that would go in and sell projects to people like Coors and Land O'Lakes. So, exceptionally heavy industrial ag at that point. We're part of the value chain that is every Coors Light that makes it into a can, right? Big stuff. Worked for those guys for about 7 years, did stuff all over the country, had some international trips with them over to Europe and down in South America, kind of seeing how that works. And about the time we had Emma, our oldest, made the switch to a private equity firm, a small family office that invests in agriculture and energy. And what was really interesting is my operations, sales, and general management experience with my financial background coalesced into this very weird skill set that worked exceptionally well in private equity, because I could look at the math, but I also understood what they were doing. Because at that scale, most private equity companies, if you're not netting $1 million a year on $5 million in revenue, they don't even want to look at you. And that's a very, very small PE deal, like Taylor's deal. If you look up Epic Snacks, I think it was announced they bought them for $100 million. That's more the realm of private equity type deals, because at scale, you make money. And at startup scale, you spend money. So what was interesting, when we started Colorado Craft Beef, I was still working for Bratney. I still, for the first couple of years, was working in private equity. I've taken on some consulting roles and moved out of private equity to do our own stuff. And when we started Colorado Craft Beef, I've taken this 15 years and condensed it into like 4 minutes. But we looked around and said, who does what in this space? There's a lot of people in the direct-to-consumer space that, I'm trying to say this nicely, they don't do it in a way that's going to be profitable in a longer-term format. There's a lot of people in the direct-to-consumer space that raise 10 or 20 or 30 animals a year because that's what the space they have for it, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that's not... Actually, I'll say it better. A good buddy of mine does a lot of consulting as well. And he said, if you can't leave your business and go to the Bahamas for 2 weeks and talk to nobody, and the business continues to run, it's not a business, it's a job.
Yeah.
Same.
There's a lot of people in the direct consumer space that it is another method for their farm to make money, but it's not a standalone enterprise. We didn't want that. Now, we are a 5th generation cattle ranch. My wife is generation 5 on the ranch. Our little girls, who I can hear through the wall over here, are generation 6. The ranch was founded a 1/4 mile over my left shoulder in a set of trees. And the house that actually was built on the farm in the 1910 area is still standing in town. They moved it into town in the 50s. So we don't come from this, hey, we're first generation, we're going to make it work. We come at this from, we've got 4 generations of people behind us that have made it work. And when we sat down and talked to Kara's dad, he was mentioning ranch succession planning, who's going to take what over. And I'm a business nerd, and this was in 2015. And I asked him, I said, well, I understand your business model just enough to be dangerous. I said, can we do what you do? And he said, no. That's a gut check moment.
Wow.
And Kara's also in corporate sales. She has a master's in cattle nutrition. And we basically looked at each other and said, what can we do to make the ranch generationally viable, past ourselves, past our kids, in a way that is at scale to make money? Because you've got to own real estate. There's some of these regenerative guys that talk about, oh, I don't own any real estate. Well, if we look at the value chain of agriculture, typically in a production, the only value you have in your company is the real estate. You can't sell a farm with an EBITDA multiple. It doesn't work. You have hard assets. You have rolling stock and you period. So how do you build a consumer company in a fashion that it becomes a business, not an ancillary income stream for your farm? And that's what we set out to do. And this year, we're 30 times larger than we were in 2018. We ship nationally. In 2020, we built a new building on the ranch. That's the building I'm sitting in right now. And when I say built, there's a lot of people like, oh, if you do all this stuff and you pay for it. No, the walls that you see behind me, I stood up myself. The wiring in the building, I stood up myself. I had some help along the way, but we are our own framers, our own drywallers. We are our own welders. We inspect the welds sometimes, but they will hold you up. And it becomes this entrepreneur mission with an ag mindset that you have to get it done, but you also want to build it to something different. So we did a ton of focus groups. We paid a pile of money for the right branding to start this thing. And when we started, we had a website 6 months before we had beef ready. And we started a rollout and we started garnering attention. And the first group of cattle we killed, we harvested 6 head. Right now we're harvesting 25 a month.
Wow.
So it's just a little different. And it was done intentionally that way. It was done with intent. It wasn't done like, oh, let's see if this will. And that was the conversation my wife and I had, was if we're going to start this thing, we're not going to dabble. We're not going to hope it works. We are going to take the bat and we're going to swing it. And we put the capital behind it out of our own pocket to make it work. This is not a family operation. This is Kara and I's operation. And luckily, we've been very fortunate. We got embraced by the carnivore community. We got, I actually looked through a bunch of your guys' podcasts and I'm like, been on his podcast and his podcast and his podcast. And I rolled jiu-jitsu with him and we worked with that guy. It was kind of, probably a third of the people that have been on your podcast we've interacted with.
Wow.
Like Danny Vega. I love that guy. He's so much fun.
He's awesome.
Yeah. And Rob Wolf, actually, when I met Rob with Element, I was in Kalispell, Montana to record a podcast with Andy Stumpf. And Rob came in and I was wearing a Colorado Craft Beef shirt. And he goes, hey, do you know those guys? I was like, well, I am those guys. And he's like, I'm Rob Wolf. And I'm looking at him and he has an Element hat on. I was like, oh, you're that Rob Wolf. And we've been doing work together ever since. Like, it's so bananas.
Rob's the man. We had an awesome conversation with him. Just a great guy.
He is so smart. It is scary.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. I think, did Sacred Cow come out right around the same time that you guys launched Colorado Craft Beef? It was like, wasn't it like 2019 or something like that?
Yeah. And we launched CCB in 2017. We started shipping beef in 2018. And actually, it was probably about 8 months ago. I called Rob. I just texted him and said, hey, man, give me a buzz when you get a minute. And I thanked him because for any of your listeners who haven't listened to Sacred Cow or read Sacred Cow, that is without a doubt the best book about agriculture I've seen in my career. It was done from an objective point of view to look at different metrics, to look at the economics and the viability of multiple systems. And because typically when I listen to another agricultural podcast or I listen to an ag book written by somebody not in ag, or some of the first generation ranchers, I end up screaming at my phone. And I told Rob, I said, I wanted to do that a couple of times, but you guys always brought it around with an argument that couldn't be denied. And I appreciate that. I appreciate you bringing it full circle. And the most interesting part of that was Rob and Diana that wrote the book were on Rogan's podcast earlier this year. And near the end of their podcast, they actually talk about We almost couldn't get the documentary done because their findings were that grass finished is not as awesome economically as everybody talks about. And they said, we considered not putting it in the book because we got so much hate for it from the industry. But they ended up keeping it in anyway and really telling the accurate story of the data. And I applaud them for having the courage to do that.
Yeah, that was one of the first things that came to mind when you were saying how Rob is a stand-up guy and Sacred Cow is just like the definitive book on understanding red meat and agriculture. That specific chapter, I think one of the things that he had mentioned, I think him and Diana both mentioned this on Rogan's podcast, is how their book just pissed everyone off. It pissed off plant-based people. It pissed off people that are advocates of grass-fed, grass-finished, because they just say it exactly how it is. And you're reading this thing and you're just expecting them to say that, grass-finished beef is nutritionally the best quality thing. And I think the sentence they say is like, we wish that we could say that it's the case, but based on the data and everything that we've researched, it's just not true, which is incredibly interesting.
Yeah. So I actually asked Danny Vega about that. Another shout out to Danny, because like I mentioned, I'm not a science guy. Science, the nutritional side, I have somebody for that. She's offices through that wall. And I asked Danny, I said, hey man, what's the deal with all these omegas? Everybody, because all the grass finished guys tout omega-6, I believe it is. Maybe it's 3.
Omega-3.
Yeah. But if you look at it, Danny explained it the best I've ever heard him explain. He's like, well, yeah, there's 3 times as many omega-3s in grass-finished beef as there is in grain-finished. But there's nearly no omega-3s in grain-finished beef, so 3 times more is almost nothing still. If you want omegas, eat fish. And I was like, okay, good. That cleared it up. And I'm not, just to be clear, I'm not bashing on grass-finished. I would like people to do with their agricultural operation what is best for them. But, to our earlier conversation before we hit the record button, very seldom are these things binary. You can't say grass finished is the best, grain finished is the best, because the model is different everywhere. Will Harris was just on Rogan's podcast, and Will's the CEO of White Oak Pastures in Georgia. Well, he mentioned that they have 3,300 cows on 3,200 acres. Well, that's a stocking rate. And for those non-ag people, stocking rate is the amount of cows per unit of land. That's a stocking rate that we are not even anywhere in the ballpark of. So a square mile is 640 acres. And he has 3,200 acres. I'm running the math right now. That is 5 square miles on the nose. We at Colorado Craft Beef can have 80 head on a square mile. So in the same land that Will Harris can run 3,300, we can run 500. Wow. And that's not a practice thing. We get 11 inches of rain a year, and I think Bluffton, Georgia gets like 45. It's rain, it's soil type, it's the climate. I mean, you're in southern Georgia, you might have winter, but it doesn't snow. I mean, it was 10 below here last Thursday. All the grass is dead. There's no nutritional value in that standing forage. And now if you put a bunch of cattle out there, it actually breaks up the root structure of that pasture, and you're going to have dirt blowing, which is bad for carbon. So we have a certain way we have to manage our real estate that doesn't work somewhere else. Because heavy rotational grazing like those guys are doing is awesome. I support what they're doing. We have guys 50 miles from here that can do that, but they're on hard packed, like hard top ground. Where we ranch is all sand hills. If we put that kind of a cattle load in one of our pastures, it'd be a sand dune in a week.
Is it something that you guys could, I was just going to ask, is it something that you guys could build towards? Like if soil quality improves and you're able to get more nutrients back into the soil, does that improve your stocking capacity?
Not really, because we don't have irrigation. We get rain when it rains. That's how we water the pastures, and it's all sand. So you aren't going to change a 4-foot layer of blow sand that's been here for 2,000 years. And just to be clear, none of this land has been farmed since the 40s. It's all native, natural grasslands, period. Occasionally, and I don't know the last time it was done. I think it was done. My father-in-law mentioned that he had 2 pastures that he sprayed for cactus, because we have some nasty like soapweed cactuses here. And you have to aerially spray them with a airplane. And he did that in the early 90s. That was the last time anything's been applied anywhere on the ranch.
Wow.
So there's just not a lot you can do. Like, we do spread the manure from the holding pens that we use for shipping and receiving cattle. We spread that on the pastures. We do a lot of other things to try to help it. But when people say, oh, you've got to regenerate, well, this hasn't changed. This is almost identical to what it was when the buffalo were here, 300 years ago.
Jeff, how different is the lifestyle of a rancher depending on where you are in Colorado versus the mountains of Colorado versus, a rancher in West Texas to a rancher in Southern Georgia?
Man, we don't even have to extend it that far.
Yeah.
I mean, the ranchers to our west, they have farm ground. We don't. Mm-hmm. So they raise some hay, they raise some row crops that they'll cut for silage to use in a feed yard. The ranchers to to the east, which is just 3 miles straight through that wall, they have just a little bit of farming, and they have a feed yard, and they truck stuff in, and they do silage. It's all exceptionally dependent on the real estate you have. And it's just that simple. I mean, we have a feed yard for Colorado Craft Beef. We own it under a different name with a business partner, so it's a separate entity technically. It's about 15 miles that direction, but it's near a bunch of farming. So the ranchers up there, they live on the river bottom. They raise their own hay. You're able to do things like I was talking to somebody about it, and they said, oh, so agriculture is an economic thing, like economic regions. I said, no, it's micro regions. Because just for instance, I'm on the eastern edge of the ranch. Like, my father-in-law's ranch starts behind me at the road, which is about 250 feet back. And it goes, for miles in the other direction through other family ground. If we get a rain event, we get a big storm that rolls through. And this happened just this summer. We got an inch of rain at our house overnight. My father-in-law, who's a mile and a half behind me, got 3 inches. And 4 miles the other side of him, they got closer to 5.
Wow.
So you're talking a 6-mile stretch of continuous monitoring, and you have, 18% of the moisture you had on the other side of the ranch. So you may have a whole ranch that spans 5 miles square, and you have to graze one side differently than the other. So, and then you take that and you look at the guys in the mountains. What's the gentleman's name? One of your sponsors?
Jason Rick.
Yeah, Jason. I listened to his podcast, and he's like, yeah, for 45 days, we're covered up in snow. Well, we usually don't have that problem, but we may. I mean, it's very common that we would have that problem. Where are you going to get hay from? What kind of feedstuffs do you have? That's all driven by the region that you're in. Because if somebody in Georgia wants to feed a bunch of, well, a great example, cottonseed is one of the ones that's used down in the South a lot, like in Texas. Well, that's where cotton is grown. You have that byproduct. We can't get that here, and it's only 4 hours away. And that's one of the weird things within agriculture, that when people tell me, oh, this is how I ranch, I think this model is perfect, everybody else is wrong. No, that could be the case, or it could be that works well for you. Like listening to Taylor, and they reintroduced a bunch of stuff at their ranch, and they got the soil back. Outstanding. That's awesome. Is it functional on a very economic basis? I don't know. Because when Will Harris was on Rogan's podcast, he was talking about the industrial side of agriculture, that if you're in Georgia and you have a cotton picker, the cotton picker was $1 million. And that's just math. It is $1 million. And all those cotton gins are regionally located, and most of those are co-op owned. So all the families own a part of that gin. So you have to grow cotton because all your hard assets are tied up in cotton picking equipment, and then all the family assets are tied up in co-op. You can't break the cycle. Mm. And quite frankly, if everybody broke the cycle, I don't know that we could feed everybody or keep them in clothes. because I think Jason's comment was, I forgot the number, but it was like 3,800 head were harvested in small regional harvest facilities in 2020, I think, or 2021. Do you guys know how many cattle are harvested nationally every week?
How many?
Like 600,000 or something like that.
Yeah, around 660,000.
Wow.
So, and then it's 3 times that many pigs.
Wow.
And annually, we harvest 2 billion chickens in this country. Well, we can't all do that in our backyard.
Mm.
And I wish we all could. But the other flip side of that, if we start thinking about the economics of ag, and this is something not a lot of people talk about, and actually Jason alluded to it on his podcast, was, well, the economics of ag margins have gotten tighter. Well, they have, but the reason for that is, big corporate, and there's a bunch of other things that drive those models. But the cost of real estate and the cost of other things drives a big part of that. But a good metric for everybody listening is in the 70s, for every dollar you put into agriculture, you could expect to get $1.35 back. And most people with a business mind say, hey man, if I could do that every time, that's all right. I can feed my family with that. Today, that same number is 14 cents. So the profitability of agriculture in the last 50 years has fallen by around 60% on the unit basis.
Mm.
So when somebody wants to badmouth commercial agriculture for optimizing and maximizing yield, I get it. I understand the motivation. But let's understand the other side of that. And for things like Roundup or going organic or any of the other chemical conversations, I understand the basis for that. But if we take Roundup away tomorrow, what's that going to do to our food supply? And what's the alternative? Because the alternative, if you take away glyphosate and you still need to do something for weed mitigation at a chemical level, it's going to be gramoxone. And gramoxone is nasty, nasty stuff. Like if it gets on your skin, you'll blister.
Really?
Yeah. And I'm not advocating for Roundup, but what I am saying is what we're looking at is an agricultural system that operates to feed us with the safest, most reliable, lowest cost food system in the world. And if we're going to go in and start taking away tools, the public has to know that your cost of food is going to go up. The public is going to have to know that if Colorado Craft Beef has to provide all the beef for everybody, man, that price is not going to be received well by a lot of people. And we know that. And a lot of our brothers and sisters in the direct-to-consumer side know that. That's why we have to do what we do, because the commercial market won't pay us for that. But I also know that the town 20 miles from here has 17,000 people in it. I don't know if I could feed all the beef into that one city. So if we're going to start changing these value chains and we're going to really start tipping everything on its head with an activist attitude, who doesn't get food? Because we have to be very careful with that.
Yeah. I was going to ask you this earlier. How much of the conventional feedlot agriculture gets shipped overseas, or the processing that happens in poultry and in pork gets shipped overseas? Like, is there a more regionalized local approach that we could start, steering some of the policy towards that might help in terms of getting us away from this high input model? Because I think you did say, like, you're not supporting glyphosate, but glyphosate clearly does have negative effects on human health. So if we can mitigate that or lower the usage of that, even just marginally over a long enough period of time, there are positive effects of that. So I guess my question really is, like, how can we slowly steer this ship in a better direction than it is right now?
I would say the first thing people have to do is vote with their dollar, because the capitalistic side of this will drive policy. Mm. I mean, there's a lot of people that want to support, voting with your dollar and being truly informed. Because I talked to a friend of mine. I actually shared this same story on Andy Snuff's podcast when I was on it. I talked to a good friend of mine that runs a chemical crop inputs location in Idaho. And I said, man, if you could say anything in a megaphone of your business, what would you say? And he goes, oh, I got it. He goes, I have 250 SKUs in my warehouse. So, all right. And he said, 50 of those are labeled organic. And those are the 50 nastiest chemicals in my shop. So what do you mean? So why would that be? He said, it's the raw elements. It's straight XYZ, whatever it is. It's not engineered to be safer for us as humans. So he goes, those are the nastiest chemicals we have to deal with on a daily basis. So a lot of people will say organic is better for whatever reason. Well, organic farming on average produces about 16% less food per acre. And that's on average. There's some crops that's exceptionally lower. So we have to do a net value assessment. And that's a hard one because people want to have their talking point. They don't want to actually look at it.
Right.
And I'm not advocating for either side. I'm just talking about the numbers.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, 10% of the United States population is food insecure right now. And we're talking about we need to take things away because food production is out of control. Okay, I can see both sides of that as well. But what do we do to help fix the better problem? If people aren't eating enough, let's fix that. And then what do we do for our kids? Our kids need to eat well. They need to have safe food. What do we do in 30 years? Because we're not going to change it in 6 months. Mm-hmm. And that's really our message is not buy my beef. Ours is the best. Although I am, I am biased. I had a ribeye for lunch. It was awesome. And Dr. Baker has said, he's like, man, I could pick your steak out of a lineup. How do you guys do it?
He does say that too. I've heard him say it multiple times.
I appreciate every time he says it. I just get a big old smile on my face because that guy eats more beef than anybody I know.
100%. He's the king of ribeyes. He's eating like 4 to 6 a day. It seems like. When
we were at his house, there was me, him, and another guy. And we sat with those monster obnoxious knives. It's like, here, eat with this. And I was like, okay, I hope I don't get anybody's finger, but whatever. And, the hard part is we can't change all these systems overnight. We need to make a discerned effort to understand them. And as consumers, we all owe it to ourselves to understand that too. Mm-hmm. So to your point about exports and things like that, or, the term factory farming is one of the ones that drives me crazy the most. Because factory farming in the beef space doesn't really exist. When you get to the feed yards, it can, because some of those feed yards are big. I mean, some of the feed yards in this country are 70 or 80,000 cows. Some of them get into 6 digits. Wow. I mean, and that sounds ugly by the math, right? But if we think about the budget that those guys have to take care of stuff, and if they are that big, they're regulated to a very high degree. I would venture to guess that the quality of care they have is probably as good or better than even the small guys because they're motivated. They've got the right people. They've got the right systems. Because if you have 100,000 head in a feed yard, I'm just going to do the math right now. If you are finishing 100,000 head, that is $200 million worth of inventory on the ground. That's worth approximately zero if it does not make it to the harvest facility. Wow. So I'm not trying to be the money nerd, but capitalism does drive some of this stuff.
No, you're offering a valuable perspective that I think is changing. It's adding a really good perspective to the way that Harry and I think about things. And that actually led me to the next question that I had for you is just your perspective on the large corporate packers and the centralization of the beef industry, because that's something that we have talked a lot about on this show. But I think, for both Harry and I, we're not the rancher like you are. We're not the expert. We're really the enthusiast that's trying to understand and unpack this industry. So I'm just curious, even with something like the Big Four Packers, is it similar to glyphosate where it's like a necessary evil until we create these more localized systems or more sustainable systems that could maybe replace some of that centralization? I don't know, but I'm just curious to get your thoughts on it.
I think that's a great way to describe it, Brett. I don't agree with the model. I don't like how it functions. And, one of the reasons for us founding Colorado Craft Beef was the conversation with Kara's dad, of course, but Dave, love the man. He's a price taker. He has to be. When you're in that commercial chain, you're a price taker all day long. And Colorado Craft Beef exists because we want to make our own price point. And that comes with its own level of risk as well, right? But I don't know functionally how you harvest 660,000 head annual or weekly and get them to all the grocery stores in a way that it operates today. Have you guys heard of Temple Grandin?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Temple actually wrote, Dr. Grandin, excuse me, I want to show her the respect she deserves for everything she's done. She wrote a opinion piece right after everything went sideways with COVID. And she said, the big packers are efficient, but they are exceptionally fragile. And she was talking about the beef supply chain as a whole, because the interesting part of that is during COVID, the lowest numbers we had during the whole pandemic for harvest weekly was only 440,000. So we lost a third of the production capacity, which isn't great, but it's not the end of the world like everybody thought it was. We actually had a transportation issue because we have a just-in-time delivery system that if you're a Walmart in wherever, you get a meat truck Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Well, they don't have extra trucks sitting around waiting to be dispatched where that dude can pick up the phone and be like, hey, send me another truck, we're empty. It just doesn't exist. Those trucks don't exist. And that's what a lot of people like, oh, the beef system went upside down. I'm like, no, it's freight. Those trucks don't exist. Those semis are 140 grand a piece brand new. Then throw a $30,000 trailer behind it. Then you have a shortage of drivers. So let's open our minds and see the rest of it is really what I'm trying to get people to do in a way that helps us figure out a solution and doesn't demonize everybody that doesn't do it our way.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a good approach. I mean, these things aren't going to change overnight, as you said. So you kind of do need to take this really long-term view on it and really, focus on the things that you can change in the day-to-day, in your day-to-day business or as a day-to-day consumer. But at the end of the day, we really need to take a longer-term view on things and try to steer the ship in the right direction. I'm curious. So COVID obviously probably played a huge impact in your business. What sort of things did you see change? And are you worried at all about food security going into the future? I mean, things are looking a little bit, less than certain in the next handful of months. So I'm curious for your perspective on that too.
So food security for the U.S. as a whole shouldn't be a problem. There's an avian flu going on right now. You're having trouble getting turkey for Thanksgiving. Eggs are in short supply. But food in general, and now becomes a question of what kind of food. You can buy all the Oreos you want, but eggs and turkey are in short supply. Maybe that's a problem.
Yeah.
But I think by and large, the U.S. exports more food than they can make, or has an exportability because we do manufacture and generate more product than we can consume. For us to go upside down on that as a country would be shocking to me. Could we see some regional hiccups? Oh, hell yeah, we could. Mm-hmm. I mean, you guys are down in Austin, right?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, you guys had the Snowmageddon, Icemageddon 2 years ago, and you guys were upside down for 3 days with respectfully what looked like an average amount of snow here on a Tuesday. But you guys aren't set up for it. And I mean that respectfully, but if the Keys were back up and running, like a week after that last hurricane, because it happens all the time. If that same type of storm hit here, it'd be bad news. So by and large, I think the U.S. from a food security standpoint will be fine. I think you could have regional problems if, infrastructure fails, like bridges, power lines, things like that. I think the bigger argument is internationally, when you have large populations in countries that do not produce enough of their own food, they rely on imports. And you have things like a war in Ukraine, which provides 30% of all the grain for Europe that may or may not get harvested, that may or may not get through the Black Sea. That creates some weird stuff because there's other parts of the world that depend on that product. And now how that affects things geopolitically and, raises the prices in a certain market and drags it from one area to another, all those things start to interconnect. That's where I think things could get weird. Our government, for whichever side of the government you choose to support, uses food and agricultural products as a way to stabilize the world economy and stabilize regions. I mean, if you look at what the UN is typically doing, or NATO, they're doing peacekeeping operations, but one of the first things they do with that is they make sure populations are fed. People haven't eaten for a day, they have a tendency to be a little mad. So when you start to really take it outside the borders of our country, where we are very fortunate to be, I mean, let's not forget that. I think the long-term food insecurities could be very, very weird. And I don't know what to do about that.
Yeah.
So I do appreciate the conversations about chemicals or animal health and all those things. And those are all very, very important. But I would also like all of us to understand how fortunate we are to be able to be worried about those things and not something like, man, the Black Sea's closed. We depend on all of our grain coming from the Ukraine. We don't produce any of our own food. What the hell are we going to do?
Right.
Yeah. So I feel very fortunate we can have conversations like this when we all know that we can go have a steak and a beer later without any problem. Because there's a lot of people in this world that don't have that level of security. There's a lot of people in our own country that don't have that.
100%. It's an amazing perspective to have. And bringing it back to the beef, Jeff, do you think that is there concern with our ranching industry, just how much we rely on countries like Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, in terms of like importing cattle in? Or is it not as widespread to actually be concerned about when we think supply chain?
I think there is concern there because I think there's a lot of people playing games. I think Jason was it Jason or Taylor was talking about Whole Foods and their important stuff and shutting off local producers.
Yeah, it was Jason.
Yeah, that should be criminal. I mean, you want to incentivize people to do certain things, and then you can bring it in from other countries, whether it's beef or microchips or whatever, pharmaceuticals. That's a big one. So outsourcing a lot of that production of things that we depend on, I think is something we really need to look at as a country. But the one caveat to that I would say, we are one of the few countries in the world that feed cattle with grain. Because if you're in Colombia or you're in India or you're in Australia, that grain needs to go for people because they don't have an excess of food. They don't have an excess of ground they can grow that grain on to feed those cattle. So what we end up with in the US, where a lot of the imported beef actually comes into play, and again, not supporting it, just sharing how the system works, is we end up with additional fat trim in the US from grain finished beef that have, I don't want to say excess fat, but they have more fat than you need to grind into the burger that we have trimmed. And we have to import lean beef from other countries to grind that fat into to not waste it. That's about the only way that when I hear about imported beef, if I'm like, well, if that's what they're doing, I can kind of support that because it's uncommon. We have a really good friend of ours. She works for the U.S. Meat Export Federation. And she said, in the vast majority of the world, burger is not a thing. Burger is not a commercial product. Really? So they don't have fat trim. They don't have this other stuff to get rid of. We're the only country that really has burger as a commercialized product. Not to say you can't get a hamburger everywhere else in the world, but as far as it being a commodity that is produced, that's really not the case everywhere else. So that changes some of the dichotomy of how that works.
Are there any Are there any regulations on the forefront? I know Thomas Massey recently introduced a bill, and there's some talk about the Cool Act maybe getting overturned. But is there anything that you're paying attention to in that sort of ag policy space that gets you excited, or maybe gets your blood boiling a little bit?
They're always trying to do something. The most recent one we had was last year. Yeah. It was the PAWS Act in Colorado. It got defeated, luckily. They were trying to outlaw harvest of cattle under 5 years of age. They were trying to outlaw castration of steers. They were trying to outlaw spaying and neutering dogs. They were trying to outlaw a bunch of this stuff. And I know there was a similar bill in Oregon that was then outlawing hunting, basically.
Wow.
So there's a lot of the animal welfare stuff that's coming up. Luckily, due to a title issue, the PAWS Act was defeated in Colorado because they basically said, I forgot exactly what the label was, but it was like, hey, defend our animals from sexual acts or something like that. It was very misleading. So that got defeated, but those kind of things come up a lot. I've seen some recent reels or, whatever social media you're into where it's people are like, we need to outlaw farming because it's bad for the global economy and the climate change, while the dude is wearing a cotton shirt and jeans and leather shoes. I mean, I just want people to understand what they're saying. And if you have an opinion and you have an agenda and you want to drive something a certain way, by all means, we live in a country where you can go do that. But please understand all of it, and vote with your dollar. We feed with grain and we finish with grain on purpose. We do it with intent. Mm-hmm. It's not for capital. It's not for any number of things. It's because it produces a more tender, more flavorful steak that more people like. It's a flavor that most people prefer. And contrary to popular belief, as reported by the U.S. Meat Export Federation, grain finishing cattle is 60% lighter on carbon than grass finishing is, because those cattle reach a natural endpoint faster. And if you think about where we're at in eastern Colorado, it's 25 degrees out today. There's really not a lot of grass growing. And when people say, oh, why do you feed grain instead of hay? Well, you can produce more grain on smaller areas, and we're storing energy for use in the winter. The same reason we've grown grain as a society for thousands of years. It produces a flavor we can age longer. From a meat science standpoint, it does that. And there's some people that do like to say that when you feed cattle grain, it makes them sick, it makes them this, that, and the other. That's really not accurate. There are things in the commercial space that need to be changed, full stop. There are things that are used in the commercial chain that I'm not a fan of. From an animal welfare standpoint, we don't do that, and we have no in-feed antibiotics. But it's funny, people say, well, no antibiotics, right? I said, well, if they get an infection, we treat them. It's our job to take care of those animals. If they have a respiratory bug that can be fixed with a 10 cc injection, we're going to do that because they don't need to suffer, because if you don't fix that, they might die. Mm-hmm. So what's the benefit of, oh, I didn't treat him with antibiotics, but he sat around sick for weeks and died? Like, I can't look at myself in the mirror. They depend on me. And, when your dog gets sick, do you give him antibiotics? When your kid gets sick, do you give him antibiotics? I think we can all agree that antibiotics play a role. Should they be in feed? Probably not. It's not something I support. So it's all done with intent to make the best quality product we can. And, I'm sure Jason does the same thing in Crawford. He does it the best way he's set up to do for the market that wants his product. And I support him for doing that. And I think he's being very creative in how he's doing it. What I'll never say is that somebody else in ag is doing it wrong. And I won't ever say that, well, the way we do it's the best. We do our best with the resources we have at our disposal. And that's all we can ask. And, to echo Jason's comment, which I really, really appreciated, he said, hey, we're just asking you to find a rancher that aligns with what you like and support them.
Yeah.
Yep.
And if that's me, that's great. I've shared this story a bunch of times. So anybody that's hearing me again, my apologies. We had a gentleman call us from the Colorado Springs area. And he said, "Hey, I heard you on a podcast. Why should I buy from you?" I said, "Oh," and we talked for a little while. And he repeated the question, but he added something. He said, "Hey, I have a rancher that I buy cattle from that I like their beef. Why should I switch to you? That's what I'm trying to get at." And I'm like, "You shouldn't." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I'm not here to poach customers. If you have a guy that produces product that you like and you want to support his farm, go nuts, man. I'm good." And it baffled him. And I said, there's 1 to 2%, depending on who you listen to, 1 to 2% of the population is involved in agriculture. And that 2% number, you got to get pretty creative. Like if you're selling tractors, you're in agriculture. If you're an ag attorney, you're in agriculture to really get it to 2%. So what I would say to everybody you've had on or anybody in agriculture, there's not enough of us to fight amongst ourselves. Support your other producers. And if the guy across the fence is doing something different, hell, go ask him about it.
Yeah.
Because there's too much of, I say this when I speak sometimes, is, the best thing about agriculture is everybody in ag is fiercely independent. And the worst thing about agriculture is everybody in ag is fiercely independent. And they think it's, change or cooperation is a 4-letter word. And there's a famine mindset that exists in producers that makes them say, "Oh, that guy got a good price for what he's doing. That means there's less money for me."
Right.
And that famine, short-sighted mindset is destroying our country, let alone just agriculture.
Absolutely. Jeff, to your point, one of the things that you had mentioned is how with you and your wife building Colorado Craft Beef, it was a very intentional decision to want to go D2C. You had taken feedback from your father-in-law and you decided, hey, the D2C route is ultimately what we want to do. And one of the other things you mentioned is how tough margins are for just the average rancher in America in general. So from your perspective, do you think that it's a good thing, or do you see a world where more ranchers are maybe able to start their own D2C companies or brands for the sake of maybe being able to increase those margins and make their overall business more profitable?
Absolutely. And they're popping up everywhere. Just like Jason, I've helped some people start their companies. I've gotten people calling me saying, "Hey, I want to raise goats in Missouri." Or honestly, the question I get the most is, since we ship nationally every week, they're like, "How in the hell do I do that?" Because that is a nasty, nasty puzzle with a lot of thorns and a lot of big holes that you can sink a lot of freaking money. And I've helped a ton of people. And I encourage people to want to try to do that with that same thing we talked about earlier. You got to be honest with yourself. Are you set up for it? And then how do you backstop it? So a great example, I'm familiar with another gentleman that actually was doing wholesale. He wasn't doing much direct to consumer, but his wholesale production price was 30% higher than my production price. And his standard was, well, the market should support me for doing it this way because it's better. Well, truth be told, they won't. That's just how marketing works. That's capitalism. You cannot have a cost of production that's 30% higher than your neighbor. And if you've been lucky enough to build a niche market and you have that attachment and you can do it, cool. But if you are starting this direct to consumer market and you say, well, I'm going to be 50% higher, and you don't have the cash to swing that, and you don't have a plan to drag that back into the commercial lines of production, you got to really get creative. Because the number of people that scaled up around us during COVID trying to go direct to consumer, you can throw a rock and hit 10 of them, because there was a shortage of beef and everybody was trying to load their freezers, which is cool because people got more of a preparedness mindset. Hey, I should maybe not have to stop at the grocery store every damn day to buy dinner on my way home. Maybe I use this garage freezer for something more than just ice for parties. But what happened was those people had higher costs of production. They didn't do the math correctly. And when the market dried up and they didn't have a web presence, they were behind. They were just behind in marketing. And then what happened is they had to offload cattle. I heard horror stories of people that had 30 or 40 head that they couldn't get sold. But And let's be fair, in the commodity market, you can take them to a sale barn tomorrow and recoup some money. So it's not as bad as if you have a trailer load of t-shirts that are horrible and nobody wants them, there's nothing you can do with them. So you can at least recoup some capital. But if you're 30% above market on your production costs and you're $600 a head loser when you have to sell commercially and you have 30 of them, can your balance sheet take an $18,000 stab in the face? Some people can, some people can't, but you have to be honest with yourself about where that's going to be. And that's probably where I see most people get hammered, is they get overextended, they get hopeful, and I encourage hope, but let's be realistic. And a lot of people think, well, once I say I'm going to sell my beef, I'll just sell it all. And that is not the case. This has been an uphill road. It's been a battle. And unfortunately, a lot of the guys that are great in the cattle business maybe aren't the best marketers. Maybe they don't like internet marketing. Maybe they don't want to go on a podcast and talk about what they do. So you have to be honest with yourself about what your skill set is. Can you make it work? I'm familiar with a company actually in Oregon, great family. They were grass-fed, grass-finished. They were crushing it. They did a sale over the holidays a few years ago. It was like 2019, actually, I think. They had 12,000 followers on Instagram. They were doing well, but they were in the middle of nowhere in Central Oregon. And they did a big sale, and they took everything to FedEx at a hub that was very small, and that truck had to go through 2 mountain passes to get to the hub that mattered. And the driver didn't show up, and FedEx didn't call him, and the truck never left, and FedEx didn't pay him back. It bankrupted their business overnight.
Wow.
So, what can you do logistically? Because that's a whole nother level. So where you can have a higher price point, you have a certain level of confidence in your logistics and all those other things that, on a micro level of, hundreds of boxes going out a week, you got to be dang good at that too. And that's a weird skill set.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear you talk about the D2C business because the logistics side of it is so complex. There's timing factors that people don't really appreciate when it comes to shipping. There's the actual raising of the beef and, processing and packaging and all these things that could go wrong. It seems almost like a business model that only a crazy person would dive into.
I look 40, but I'm actually 22.
It's such but it's something that we truly believe in. Like, if we can create these channels for people to access people like you, Jeff, and like Jason, who are, out there doing things differently, but both raising quality beef. It's like, if you can buy directly from them, that gives you guys a little bit more margin. And I think that's back to your point on voting with your dollar. If you can support you directly as a consumer, that's really the best decision or optimal decision you can make when it comes to consumer choice.
Absolutely. And I will put a small caveat on that, Harry. The commercial beef supply chain in this country is as nutritious, it's as safe as all of my stuff. So I won't say don't go buy at the grocery store. That's one thing I won't say. My quality is probably going to be different. My price point is going to be different. And your connection to where your food comes from is going to be different. But during COVID, when things were short, hey, we had to go to the grocery store too. So the one thing I won't do is, if your economic means won't allow you to buy from me or from one of my, friendly competitors, that's okay too. Don't feel like we have to have your support. We love the support. We love connecting with consumers, but, do what's best for your family. And we support that decision too.
Jeff, what is the best way for someone to go about purchasing beef directly from Colorado Craft Beef if they're interested in that?
Right on the website. So coloradocraftbeef.com. We're active on Colorado Craft Beef on all social channels. We've got quite a few partners that talk about us on the regular. But probably one of the things we've done that's a little different than some of our, true ranching brothers and sisters is we have smaller bundle boxes. You don't have to buy a quarter beef from us. You can order 15 pounds of burger and it'll land at your house. If you want to order something custom, shoot me an email. It's on the website. And as we've grown, we've been able to add more packages. We've optimized shipping around those package sizes so that the freight meets up, so that the price per pound isn't totally out of line. But we're always looking for feedback and looking for customer connections. And if anybody's ever out near the ranch, we do recommend people stop in, say hello. But we're also, out literally in the middle of nowhere.
Which is probably the best kind of customer for you, right? Because if someone's choosing to come out there in the middle of nowhere, there's certain intentionality behind that decision to come out and visit you all.
Absolutely. Well, and we talk to people about connecting with your food. I know there's a lot of push in the agricultural space for educating the consumer, and we don't take that stance. Education, I think, kind of comes off in a demeaning way, like, well, we're going to tell them how it is. And no, I want you to engage with your food. Engage with it. Quit just consuming. Just engage with what it is. And if you're vegan, great. Engage with your food in that manner. But just understand where it comes from. Understand how it happens. If you're a vegan and you're in Chicago and you're eating pineapples January, understand the freaking supply chain that had to happen to get those there.
Totally. Well, Jeff, this has been awesome, and we really appreciate your time. We've gone a little bit longer than expected, but we got a lot out of it, and I think our audience is really going to appreciate this one. So just thank you for everything that you're doing and all the knowledge that you just shared with us and our audience. This was great.
Yeah, and I do have one more point. I've never made this point. This is just for you guys. It's come up here recently. There's a lot of talk about regenerative agriculture. Mm-hmm. I would like it known that a lot of people in agriculture were not being degenerative either. Because someone claims to be regenerative, it kind of assumes a negative for some of the other people that don't have that moniker. And that's not always the case. What John or what Jason and those guys are able to do, we're not able to. But we've also been ranching in this same spot for 110 years. So by sheer definition, we are at least sustainable. But I bet if you looked at it over time, regenerative is just the nature of the game. Because at the end of the day, if you're a corn farmer or you're a cattle rancher, your asset is your real estate. And the real estate has to produce for itself. And yes, there is soil health things we can do. And there's a lot of movement in that in the farming community. But just because someone doesn't wear regenerative rancher as a badge doesn't mean that they're degenerative.
Mm-hmm. That's such a powerful point. And I think that tying back to what you said before about being willing to be intentional and go out and meet your rancher or your farmer and shake their hand is such a powerful tool, because I would guarantee you there are so many farms that don't carry that regenerative badge like you had mentioned. But when you go out there, you see these cows that are in incredible shape, the farm, the property, the family behind it, and you realize that it's such a tremendous net good. And I think that that's something that the community and the movement needs to be doing better is regenerative is not the only way. Grass finish is by far not the only way. We need to explore these other systems and not just armchair quarterback, actually be willing, especially when you're enthusiasts like us and you're not ranchers, be willing to go the extra mile and the extra step and meet these people and really use that as your way to make your determination for yourself, and not just, it's good because it has a label or it's bad because it doesn't have this label. It's just not the best way to go about it.
Well, usually the best packaging in the store has, all the buzz labels on it, whatever they may be. Understand that each one of those labels is expensive. To make a label claim on a package that's in a retail setting has to be approved by USDA. Mm-hmm. And to get that moniker that you can put on your packaging is expensive. So a lot of times, not going to name any names, I'm familiar with some grass finished brands in Colorado, none that we've talked about today, just to be clear, that it's literally old roping steers that are turned on pasture until it's time to harvest them, and it's grass finished burger.
Wow.
Oh, that's a labeling game. And those guys are all retail. They have no connection to the customer. So, again, not going to name any names, but if something like this truly matters to you as a consumer, meet your rancher, meet your farmer. It's very easy to do that today.
Yeah, that's something we try to echo as much as possible. Just go out there and connect in person. There's no better way to do it. So appreciate you championing that message as well.
That's right. We all got to make it work together, man.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for doing this, man. This has been an unbelievable conversation. We learned a lot, and just excited to share it with our audience too. You've given us a lot to think about today.
Sure. I appreciate it, man. Thanks for having me. I'll come back whenever you want.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.